The Wahiawa Value-Added Product Development Center adds to the educational mission of community colleges. Hawaii has celebrated success in agriculture, and we want to support local agriculture by investing and growing the Made in Hawaii, Produced in Hawaii, and Processed in Hawaii brands. Resources available on site will support local entrepreneurs in improving their products and business models, reducing the need for businesses to leave Hawaii to become viable. We offer programming curtailed around value-added businesses, equipment that are unique to Hawaii and typically too expensive for small businesses. Provide consulting and know-how to help improve products, reduce cost of production, and increase shelf life, all critical to the success of local products and are now available in Central Oahu for statewide access through the community colleges. When we look at facilities that can help support scaling products, bringing new products to market, there's very few in Hawaii. Equipment like our hyperbaric chamber that will help stabilize shelf life for products. These are things that our entrepreneurs need so that their products can get into the store, so that their products can make that trip across the ocean. Keeping businesses local, supporting local agriculture, and strengthening local entrepreneurial pipelines are core to the mission of the Wahiawa Value-Added Product Development Center and the community colleges. I would love for you to learn more about what we are doing here by looking at our website and joining us for a tour so that we can continue strengthening Hawaii's local economy through agriculture.
All right, good morning, everyone. Aloha and welcome to Value Added 101. My name is Chris Bailey. I'm the manager here at the Wahiawa Value Added Product Development Center. We're so glad you could join us as we dig into what it really means to take local ingredients and ideas and transform them into market-ready products. These web sessions highlight the individuals in our industry moving this whole movement forward. And today we're thrilled to be joined by Jon Santos. He's the principal of Common Space Studio. He's a creative strategist, systems thinker, and a champion of community-centered design. Jon's a local boy who's worked across the state and beyond, helping purpose-driven brands translate their values into products, experiences, and identities that resonate with real people. And with that, I want to turn it over to Jon. We'll just jump right in. Welcome, Jon.
Hi, Chris. Thank you for having me. Hello, everyone in the cohort. It's such a pleasure to be here. My name is Jon Santos. I'm currently living in Hawaii Kai, and part-time I'm still living in Brooklyn. And right now I'm calling in from New York State. And just a little bit of background, a lot of my experience in design started as a part of a DIY music community in Detroit where I grew up. And I ended up going back to design school in San Francisco and graduated kind of later in life in the year 2000 with a bachelor's of fine art and design. And I moved to New York City to get a little bit more industry experience. I've also taught communications design at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn for 13 years. And so I've decided that I want to try and leverage some of my experience and expertise in the food and beverage industry into helping innovators and more emerging folks who are out there. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So just to sort of go over the agenda for today, we're going to talk about visual identity and kind of unpack all of the various terminologies that are thrown around when talking about marketing a brand. We're going to talk about storytelling and how a lot of these actually end up building physical community. And we're going to talk a little bit about how a graphic designer works through their process and what exactly they deliver on, and maybe a little bit of what to expect if you have not engaged a graphic designer yet. We're going to skip over the intros, and then we're just going to start by talking about the merchandising spectrum. So before understanding the design of a package, I like to think about the context for how the products are displayed in a retail environment and how you arrive at them. So for example, I like to zoom out and think about these very different experiences. One being Mana Up, which I'm not sure if everybody has been there, in Hawaiians in South Shore Marketplace, and obviously Aloha Stadium. And we're really talking about what I still consider to be somewhat of a DIY starting point for both of these things, but I think different decisions were made in terms of how packaging is designed and presented, obviously there are different constraints on what's possible, but it's really important to consider. So zooming in, just to think about how the presentation of the product sets a precedent, sets a precedent, and how to think about what's inside, and I kind of refer to this as the procession, unboxing something, removing a layer, unwrapping an object, seeing a product lying in a bed of like shredded recycled paper. All of this is like building value. And so, obviously there's the material aspect of it, but my specialty is to sort of like really unpack what are the parts of the visual identity that make up not just the packaging, but the brand, the logo, and how all of the visual elements work together. So today we're going to explore the complexity of food and beverage brands and take a closer look about how these came into being. So I started designing in the early 90s. And from what I remember, the general public was not as visually literate as they are today. I think now so many regular people who don't really think about fonts are able to name fonts. And I think what used to be fairly obscure is now become pretty common. In some ways, the more people are aware of graphic design as more and more food and beverage brands proliferate, I think it becomes really important that the brands stand out, especially with more and more brands hitting the marketplace. So I went to FoodieCon a couple weeks ago, and I got to see a lot of vendors. I was pretty overwhelmed by the selection. Some people I'd heard of, some other people hadn't heard of, and personally, I kind of gravitated towards the visuals to me that like really stood out. And of course, I'd look at the food. I came across this statistic that 70% of consumers are influenced by a brand's visual appeal, and that this directly impacts their purchasing decision. This underscores why the quality of the graphic design isn't optional. I think we tend to think about this as being pretty essential. So for context, for this particular cohort, I'm thinking specifically about Hawaii-based CPG products and how they might stand out in another marketplace. And this is these are some photos I took here in New York City of a pop-up grocery store that's designed just to support emerging CPG brands. So it's kind of like Mana Up, but it's really just focusing on snacks and beverage products. So for context, I wanted to talk about vernacular, and in particular, we are still in New York City. And so I like to think about how, in terms of the history of the city, in the early 1900s, artisans were the ones who were creating these signage designs. They kind of developed a free-form visual language, and they naturally incorporated unspoken cultural norms, resulting in simple, purpose-driven designs. And that's what we call vernacular. So we refer to this kind of design as vernacular design. And at that time, the public wasn't really exposed to a diversity of visual languages. I think there were pretty far and few between. So this is a logo that we designed for a restaurant in Soho called The Dutch in 2011. And the timing was, it was kind of this harmony of timing in that I met the Dutch, and the owners of the Dutch, and we were talking about a graphic design direction that kind of reinterpreted this early 20th century signage. So by blending Art Nouveau's flowing forms with the clean lines of modernism, we kind of created this logo, the Dutch, which interpreted those early New York City storefront signs. And this was nominated for a James Beard Award, which for me was kind of a happy accident. And when I look at this now, the restaurant's still going. I look at this design now, and one of the questions I ask myself is, how does it stand the test of time? So now pivoting back to Kaka'ako, or Ward Center specifically, I work at box jelly every day, and I go to Nalu like 3 or 4 times a week, and I think about their visual identity, and I think about the other layers of trust that a customer builds to a brand, not just through the experience of being at a physical place, but I think about the graphics and the kind of loyalty that's created with graphics that kind of resonate. In particular, with this logo, I love the repeating shapes of the N and the A and the U, and how they're kind of they all kind of look like each other, and it still looks like it's from Hawaii, and it still respects a local vibe, but it has this like international flair. It has kind of like a modern design sophistication to it. So brand loyalty is built through consistent, memorable experiences and the customer journeys, and how the customer journey relies on visual cues to build trust on that initial engagement. And this, in particular, I think is what helps to create a repeat visit. So I encourage everybody to think about the brands they love and why you go back to them, other than the way that it tastes. Is there something about the way that it looks or the way that it smells? And how does that relate to the interior design, and how does that relate to the visual identity? So the core building blocks of branding are the visual identity, which is a whole made up of a few parts. It is often configured in different ways. It's okay if there's still a little bit of confusion around this after looking at some of these slides, because different brands approach this in different ways. And so I just kind of wanted to introduce a little bit of this graphic designer mindset. So a logo type or a word mark is it's a typographic rendering of a brand that can vary in style. They typically don't have symbols or iconography. Logo types are a good direction for brands with a strong, memorable name. So it's just really riding off like reading the word. So the Rusty Knot was a tiki bar on the west side of Manhattan, on the water, facing the Hudson River and the New Jersey skyline. Our typographic direction was based on TV show Gilligan's Island, and I was really thinking about the nostalgia and how that nostalgia would connect to that particular audience, this like lower Manhattan creative professional, or a lot of professionals working in entertainment. And so obviously this narrative is really designed for that particular audience. And I think that the narrative hook of like the visual look of Gilligan's Island is something that help people remember and attach to the brand. So a logo mark is more of like a symbolic image or an icon that stands in place of the name or the business. There are brands that use a logo type instead of a logo mark. A logo mark instead of a logo type, and it depends on how widely known the logo mark is for this strategy to be successful. So this is a logo mark for an Italian restaurant in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, called Burano. It was designed to be used on the chef's aprons and the work jackets, not necessarily to be a surface that needed to have the name spelled out clearly. In other words, it's not meant to drive traffic to the restaurant. In fact, by the time you see this logo, you're already there. Sometimes it's a case that these marks become popular, and then you can merchandise them. You can merchandise the graphics in various ways once the audience knows who you are. But obviously, it takes a bit of marketing effort to build on that value or to build on that popularity. The design inspiration for this comes from Art Deco motifs that are really pervasive in New York City. So we collaged the letters of the word Burano into a form that was representative of the interior design, which had a lot of circular and line motifs. This is for a winemaker on the central coast of California. This is a project that we have still in progress, and it's a logo. So I'm defining this logo as all of the marks that represent the brand. So in this case, we created multiple formats for the logo to be designated on different surfaces. The badge in the upper left was used for jackets, hats, and the website homepage. And we're also actually at this right now, we're printing that onto a wine bottle label that's going to be on their first vintage, because they don't normally make wines; they sell their grapes to winemakers. So the round stencil graphic on the right was applied to the plastic bins that are used to harvest the grapes and sit on the property. Like strong horizontal placement. The property is close to the coast, and all of the rocks on the property have imprints of shells on them. So if you look at that rock there, there's like it's like fossilized. Almost every rock looks like that. And what's also really interesting about this property is that you're really high up in the mountains, and there's ocean sand everywhere. And so for our branding, we really wanted to focus on this terroir, which is very rare, which is to have this kind of ocean bed at the top of a mountain. So the symbols on that logo are meant to be like this reciprocal relationship between the highlands and the ocean, and the sort of like movement and the cycles of the sun and the moon. So for review, some brands just have a logo type. Some brands just have a logo mark. Some brands have a bunch of different things to represent themselves. So now I'd like to maybe further unpack a visual identity, which is kind of hard to wrap your head around sometimes as being a consumer, because you might not see all of the parts of a visual identity at once. You might encounter them at different points in that customer journey. So a visual identity is a system of visual elements that represent the brand, and it typically comes with a guideline for how you can use those parts together. And sometimes we make templates for the client so they can just reuse them if they want, or if they want to edit them, they can. So here I'm showing how the branding for Maculina shows up on a few different surfaces. And just to sort of break down the components, you have a logo, a color palette, the typography. So not just the font, but how it's used, if it's all caps and if it's lowercase, what is the scale? These are all the things that graphic designers think about in designing something. And obviously these things become more tangible in print. And we also think about scale, like how big does a logo on a shirt relating to the service relate to, like how does that work on a business card and how does that work on a sweatshirt? And we think a good visual identity should yield the assets necessary to create a recognizable and consistent brand across all touch points. And that's not always achieved by slapping the same logo on everything. So in particular, I think our style is to not just take the logo, the same logo, and put it on everything, but to create a system of parts that all relate and create a bit of mystique and sophistication. So jumping back now into a Hawaii-based brand, I wanted to talk a little bit about Waiʻikea and their brand strategy, which is different than a visual identity. In fact, the brand strategy is the foundational work that is done before you can create a brief on what the graphic design direction should be about. So a lot of what we're going to review here are things that happen before the product or the packaging design, and sometimes the branding. Sometimes this happens before the branding is even designed. So purpose. Purpose is about why we exist. For Waiʻikea, it flows from source to story, from Mauna Loa's slopes and through the land to the ocean, and also in particular what they're interested is their global impact. So I think this is a really heavy lift for somebody to actually write the brand purpose and also the mission. So Waiʻikea is carbon neutral certified. It uses 100% recycled PET bottles and invests in clean water initiatives. And I think this is pretty successfully communicated in their packaging design and in their branding. I think that the logo is very literal in how it communicates their purpose and mission. And I really like that the typeface it's very modern, it's international, and it has a respectful sensibility of a respectful reference to place. So with the core values, each of these should show up in both internal decision-making and customer touch points, meaning if you create some kind of a marketing deck that you want to share with your partners, these core values should be communicated typically with words, pairs of words, or different kinds of mood board images to help partners understand what the vibe is. I like to think about each of these things and how these things become visible. Positioning. So um, I'm thinking about how this bottle also positions itself on the shelf. In particularly, I try not to buy bottles of water. I try to use my metal bottle of water as much as possible. But when I go to the store, my eye is kind of scanning the shelf to look for that. And I'm bringing up this reference to a high-end grocery store in Los Angeles called Erewhon, which is they carry a lot of sustainable luxury brands, or what they call sustainable luxury brands. And part of their approach is that they're thinking about values versus exclusivity. And I think obviously the price point might exclude people from buying, but there is a very highly competitive visual thing happening here on the shelf, and how the visual positioning relates to how you want to position the product just with words. And so which brings me to talking about advertising, and in particular with advertising, if you work with a copywriter, we like to refer to the tone of voice, which is basically the emotional tone of the brand. And I like to think about it as even like a stylistic way of writing, which makes you think that there's like a person behind that ad. Like if they're talking, you can imagine what that person looks like, even if maybe you can't see that person. So the personality and the tone really comes out through copywriting and how the product is marketed. So in terms of the visual identity system, so it's something we just looked at a few slides ago. This also will never appear visually, but it becomes an anchoring element and the overall brand direction, which could become a guideline that is shared with marketing partners and even the design team. So what you would see in a visual identity system is like a color palette with actual hex colors and RGB colors of exactly what colors to use for partners. And then it would have a typography, which would clearly indicate what the font was and how big it should be, and basically what you can do and what you cannot do with the visual elements as they are shared with partners. So these are the stories we tell, the narrative, right? These are the stories that the brand and the product kind of speak. And so with this, I like thinking about how each of these taglines actually really speak to the product in its place. So this is something I like to think about a lot, is what is the soft power of a brand, and if it reaches this pinnacle where just outside of somebody buying the brand, they would actually start wearing the logo around on their clothing, or speaking to a product in a way where they celebrate it above and beyond something that you can just buy, which I think is kind of the holy grail in some ways for like product design. And in terms of like the product differentiation, I think why IKEA is they like to differentiate themselves by not shouting. Like I think their approach is to not be loud, but to try to be true to their origin story, and the triple bottom line and powerful alone, like together, like if all of these things are done well, I think you've achieved a really powerful way of hooking your audience, or getting them really to believe what you're talking about. So to speak now a little bit more about Erewhon and brand value. So, I like to think about art direction as a designer, and so I'm thinking about what are the things that are being photographed, and what is the lighting like, and how does that relate to the logo, and how is everything placed? Because you're really getting a sense of who this brand is, um, by how all of these elements are combined. The photo on the right, it can't really show the company's mission or values, but I think we can imagine ourselves in a photo like this. The image holistically communicates or represents the experience of physically going to Erewhon. But if you take all the social media and the product and tie it all together, you need a cohesive visual identity. And so what I'm saying is that even the way that the logo is positioned on photographs and how it's presented is all part of the branding effort, which is also referred to as art direction. So speaking more to value and how Erewhon is able to kind of manipulate this. Perceived value is not just about the product. It's about the entire brand experience. And of course, a key component of that is, for example, I make jokes with my friends about how bottles of water at Erewhon, some of them cost like $25. And I think at this point you can put an Erewhon tag on a piece of garbage and probably sell it as premium garbage. Well, for some reason, I think that this principle applies like to things that cost $25 and things that maybe cost $5. I think it's not a bad idea to take products that aren't premium and still brand them to look like they are premium. So I talk about this a lot, about how value and cost are not the same thing. So, and I think this is very easily confused by consumers who are shopping. I think most people think that value and cost are the same thing. And one way for me to differentiate it is that a price is fixed, and that's something that just stays kind of the same, or if it goes up for whatever reason, tariffs or inflation, they're relatively fixed. But the return in customer loyalty and the brand equity over time accumulates, and that's what I'm thinking of when I talk about value. Is when you think about a product, the relationship you have to that product and how you think about it is something that I think is really different from how much it actually costs. And so in this presentation, I'm calling that the perceived value. So I'm going to move on to this idea of storytelling. And this example that I'm going to use here is from an Upper East Side cocktail bar in New York called The Daisy, which is based off of a character in the novel The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. And so in this branding, we took quotes from Daisy out of the book and just used them on the postcards to kind of bring her character to life. And so the logo is that on the upper right side of that postcard, it's like two symmetrical D's that are kind of like stuck together. And we designed a neon sign that gives a visual effect of like the mark rotating or shaking. And it's supposed to also be a cobbler shaker as well. And also the way we combine the D's is to kind of, in that format on the postcards, to kind of actually make it look like a flower a little bit. And so I like to think about this idea of like soft power on the continent, which is really different than the way this unfolds in Hawaii. But in particular for this presentation, I like to think about how Hawaii brands have the power to do this outside of the Hawaii marketplace. So in particular, I want to bring up this example of this New York based restaurant, and like it's soft power, which means the cultural power that it has. And I think what is different about the continent than in Hawaii is that you can just kind of invent these things, and they're myths that may have a lifespan that can come and go in 10 years, 20 years. But the amount of these kinds of things that are born into the world and then kind of go away is really interesting to me. So this is one of the most popular restaurants in the Lower East Side. It's called Dimes. And people love the restaurant so much that as um, as a nickname, the community kind of started calling the street that it was on Dime Square, as in like kind of rhyming with Times Square. So this is kind of like you can think about it this way: health food meets streetwear meets downtown art world, and the logo kind of really became a vessel for like how people kind of see it visually on T-shirts, but it also really it became a place, a district that is like referred to as Dime Square. What's really interesting about the marketing is that it wasn't really strategic in the way that the brand proliferated. I mean, I think the owners wanted to make a really good restaurant with quality food, with really healthy food, but their fan base actually became the propagators of what made the brand grow and become what it was. I don't think it was really intended by the owners to sort of like to blow up their brand that much. It just became so loved by the people that it became something. Um, and then in terms of like merchandising, I like to think about this this deli in Los Angeles. It's called Uncle Polly's Deli. It's a throwback to a classic Queens or Brooklyn neighborhood sandwich shop. The owner's from New York, and he understands this nuanced aesthetic of 80s and 90s New York culture. And so he's an artist himself. So he started making these T-shirts, which now are 3x, like double or triple the revenue of what they do selling food in the deli. They actually do really good with the merchandise. That's Uncle Polly's Deli. So now to talk a little bit about, to pivot away from some of those and just to talk about how, what is direction? And this is like a conversation that you could have with a graphic designer. And the direction sometimes comes from the person who's propagating the brand. So it might come from you. Or if you need help, like, and you need to shape a direction, sometimes a graphic designer is able to help you develop a direction so that you can derive all the materials from. So as you can imagine, a lot of the work in design is curating. So picking the right typefaces, but also knowing the history of graphic design and having a really good eye and being able to recall visual languages from the past and combine them in new interesting ways is ultimately it's like the best strategy for connecting the narrative of your product or your brand to like the consumer. So I talked a little bit about art direction already and how I love these examples of this social media presence for Lulu and how they are able to take the branded materials but also combine them with a cohesive art direction and with the photography to present the brand in a way that really communicates experience without you even having to be there. So now just to show a little bit about how the process might work. This is a sandwich shop in a small town in upstate New York called Club Sandwich. And the owner is from Atlantic City, New Jersey, which is kind of famous for its casinos being on the beach. And, this is kind of a play on words, Club Sandwich. So these are some initial sketches that she gave to us. And then we start by putting together mood boards, which are meant to align our clients' imagination with our imagination. So just using Google Images and Pinterest, we're able to kind of start assembling like a vibe. And graphic designers really like to look at type specimens to understand how typography design from different eras can push or pull a direction. So we start by redrawing letters, either using fonts or drawing them like custom with a pen tool in Adobe Illustrator or with our hand, we draw. But I think part of the skill is in figuring out how to remix the letter forms and to try to create shapes that are a little bit more unique to the brand. And so after going back and forth with the client, so we would look at mood boards and we go back and draw stuff and have a few meetings to iterate. we start to narrow in on a few things that we like, and these ended up being three that they really liked, and then we boiled it down to one, which the finished logo is the one on top, the logo type, and the finished logo mark is the one on the bottom. And so we deliver that as like Illustrator file or PDF files and EPS files to the client, and then I want to kind of explain to you how it goes on to becoming the branding. So this restaurant, it launched just a couple weeks ago. So we make mock-ups of all the things that we envision being made for the brand. And so these are just mock-ups that we make. And we actually had to we had to make a custom typeface and redraw other letters in the alphabet so they can spell out other things. So this is a mock-up of what the website might look like. The tote bag, posters. And this is what the storefront looks like. And then we usually deliver a direction document. So this is a direction document for the winery, or the winery in San Luis Obispo that we worked on. Typically, it has like the names of the fonts and then the sizes of the typeface, the colors, and everything laid out. We also like to make mock-ups of the product to show how the branding would spread across materials. And then if this particular client wanted to produce the hat or the business card, they have the artwork, which they can either use on Canva or send to a printer and use our mock-ups to say, this is the kind of thing we're trying to achieve. And then they can send that stuff to print. We are also sometimes brought in to execute. We a lot of times make the website. We also do work with printers if a client doesn't want to deal with that. But also we would work with a client to make sure that they had the things they needed to execute on the things they wanted to produce. And that is almost an hour, Chris. I went way over my intended time frame. I hope that was okay for anyone. Are there any questions or anything?
First, yeah, thank you, John. Yeah, thank you for an incredible presentation. So looking in the chat, so we have a question from Lisa. Where do you recommend to look for sources of inspiration when you are stuck with an idea?
Where do I look?
Mhm.
I have a lot of books, so I'm a fan of print. I also use this website called Arena. It's ARE-NA. That's a little bit more difficult to navigate. Pinterest is really good for finding visual references. So just like a tip for everybody, you could find like using the example of like the casino in Atlantic City. You could put in that photo, and there's a button at the bottom for like, if you build out that board, it'll say more like this. And then the longer you start clicking on things and arranging things on the board and arranging things on that board, the better it gets at finding other things that look like it. So Pinterest's algorithm is really, really good now. In fact, you could probably just use that alone to develop a mood board.
Lisa has a follow-up question. Can you recommend some books? She's looking for good design typography books.
You know what? Apologies. It's been a while since I've looked at a book. And I think the kinds of typography books that I'm thinking of are more structural. They're more like teaching graphic designers how to use grids to design magazine layouts, website interfaces. And my favorite designer for that, his name is Joseph Muller-Brockmann. He's like a Swiss graphic designer, but to be honest, I don't know if that applies in this case to CPG. But that's the answer to that question is pretty wide. It just depends on what kinds of things you're interested in. For example, I saw like a street film posters from India, the 1960s to the 1980s book. And I love that book. I picked that up. I also picked up Japanese vintage book cover designs from like the early 1900s. Like to me, the color palettes in that and the typography, even though it's not in English, I really love the way that they're working with typography. It depends on what you're trying to do, but if you email me like a little bit of what you're thinking of, I could probably point you in the direction. That goes for anybody. If you have any questions about where to start researching or looking for visual material, I'm like a fanatic of like researching visual like languages from every era.
Thank you. Haley asks, how do you suggest test driving a new packaging or logo rebrand or a new look in the market?
I mean, so that does require actual user tests and market research. So typically, marketing research firms are hired to take a package design or an advertisement and test like customer sentiment on what and how they're looking at it. There are also ways of like using some digital tools, and I think I'm guessing that maybe even AI does that now. I wouldn't trust AI's output on that, but you would have to kind of like put together a user group if you really wanted to test a product design. I hope that answer helps.
Thank you. So, I mean, John, we work with a lot of startup food entrepreneurs. What might be a low cost, high impact branding move a new business can make immediately?
A low cost, high branding move,
High impact.
high impact. Starting a social media account. I know that's so typical of me to say, and I only say that because it takes very little investment to start building a brand with nothing. And as you know, there are millions of people on social media who've built brands with nothing, um, just to build customer awareness. So just to kind of help everybody unpack a little bit of the mission here, there's this thing called brand awareness, which means you're just telling everybody what the name is, and you're not trying to sell them anything. So if you say Waiakea, 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 and you just, I mean, I remember when Venmo launched in New York, I just saw these random ads on the subway that said Venmo with like a strange character, and it didn't say anything about it, what it was, but it made me really curious. So I remembered it and it stuck in my head. I was like, what is that Venmo thing? And then finally, when it came out, I was like, oh, that's what the Venmo thing is. So like that was a brand awareness campaign. So that's really thought of as differently as like an advertisement that's made to it's designed for you to click and buy something. That's like a sales like campaign. So I think building brand awareness through social media and any other channels that you can leverage that you already have like access to, like if you have a lot of followers on LinkedIn, obviously go on a brand awareness campaign on LinkedIn, but also um, build it on other, on as many platforms as you can. Unfortunately, Meta is still dominating that field. Um,
Are you seeing any specific challenges or advantages for a Hawaii-based brand in building that recognition?
am I seeing challenges or?
Challenges or advantages?
I mean, I see a lot of challenges. The biggest challenge is that billions of dollars were put into marketing Hawaii as a tourist destination before anyone could talk about it in any other context. And in a way, you're kind of going up against that. So, and then obviously, the more you lean on Hawaiian words that maybe are not understood outside of Hawaii, that is a big barrier to me. Um, and I think Waiakea is only now thinking about expanding out of, like really expanding out of the marketplace in Hawaii. And I would say it's not so hard to pronounce it, but it does take, there is a way to think about this idea of introducing new concepts into any marketplace. And the less familiar it is, you can think about it this way, the more time and money it takes to educate people on what that thing is, right? So I've tested this with my own brands. Like I made up a word and it's like 10 years old now. It's another project that I have. And people still ask me what it is. And it's not imperative that you know what it is before you want to buy into it. But I was aware of that when I did it. So just be aware that when you're launching something that is named something that people are not very familiar with, it's going to take a bit of a heavy lift to market it and make people understand and remember it. So that's what I would think of to be some of the challenges. Some of the opportunities. I've been working with a lot of Hawaii-based artists and showing their work in New York City and Miami. And part of my mission with that project is to bring visibility of Hawaii-based artists to the East Coast of New York. And what's really interesting in that practice in the last 5 years is that so many people say, "Wow, can you tell me what this is about?" And I'll explain. For starters, I'll explain ahupoa and the philosophy of that in the culture, and people are so moved by it. You know, so if you can hook someone and you can teach them something about Hawaii, it is priceless. But it just takes getting to the point where you can break that barrier, or you can have that. It takes to getting to that point where you can have that conversation with someone where you get their interest. First, you have to get their interest, right? Then I think if you have the opportunity to explain, I mean, that's all of the work, I think. Does that answer? I hope that answers that question. Oh, there are more questions in the chat, but I'll let you, Chris, moderate, so I'm not trying to keep up with them.
Yeah, a couple just dropped in. So Haley asks, so this is more of a workflow question with a graphic designer. So once a designer hands off that brand visual identity with some initial mockups, if the founder wants to put out an additional, say, merchandise or flyer, they can either use the brand asset to create it themselves, or can they go back to the designer to ask for additional collateral?
So usually not every studio structures this the same way. The way we structure it is if you're in your original scope, it said like that it includes visual merchandise, then we mock that up and then you get the file. And then if you need to customize it, you might have to ask the printer to change the size or something like that. Usually studios are like, if they don't include that, they're going to charge by the hour. That's how we do it. And then if, for example, they want to work more, so we have some retainer relationships with some clients where we made their website, and then we just mark that up a little bit, a couple $100, so that if, for example, because we have some clients who like every month they have 3 or 4 things they want from us, and I just say we'll just include this in this retainer so they can call us and ask for things, and there's a limit to how much they can ask for, but then we can provide them with the assets they need ongoing, like over time. And some people are not producing as much, but if some people are changing their labels every month, then I think they might need to create a retainer situation where the designer can change things for them.
So Peter has a question about how to contact you, but before we jumped into that, I might ask, so for someone interested, does it come down to just kind of figuring out in kind of a matchmaking context how to find that right partner on the branding side? And how would you, I guess, what criteria would suggest looking for if you're an entrepreneur trying to connect with that right branding partner?
Wait, so what the question is?
I guess for an entrepreneur that's kind of stepping into this space and trying to find that branding resource, what are some criteria for them to consider?
Well, should I show the first course page, Chris?
Oh yeah, please go ahead.
So for the folks in the cohort who are curious about this, there is this initiative that Chris and I we met, and I was first talking about this course that actually one of your cohort members, Johnny Kimbrough, is in our first course, Lovejoy. So basically, what we've done is we've created this program that's for innovative restaurant, food and beverage people, CPG founders. And right now our cohort is full, but basically we offer discounted services, like packaged. So our normal pricing for this kind of stuff is like 20K and up. So we scaled it down to like this menu, and Chris can email the link to you guys, but this one's designed for restaurant kind of people, but I don't see why we couldn't shape this into like a CPG kind of thing. And so this meeting with you all is to sort of just introduce this concept. And I think it's possible that Common Space create a branding cohort with this kind of pricing model just for your cohort and just for CPG. And Chris and I are talking about having another meeting in August, and I want to continue this relationship and sharing resources and educating and also offering our services. So I think it's possible that when I'm back in Honolulu in a couple months, I'd like to do some in-person cohorts. Maybe we can do some workshops. I hope that answers the question.
I guess maybe I was kind of referring to just like on this principle alone, like, like things like, getting to know a designer from their aesthetic, price point,
Oh, right.
just like general
Mhm.
criteria. Does that make sense?
So this is one thing to think about because this might come up. Let's say you imagine like a really specific style of illustration. Um, I mean, you might want to, I guess the question would be, how do you find the person who makes that specific kind of illustration? Would that be another way of asking the question? And if so, I think obviously those resources they're fewer and far between in a place like Oahu in terms of being able to find, or like on any of the islands, being able to find them unless you have a personal relationship. Um, but I think there are marketplaces online where you can find an illustrator to make something for you or a designer. But I typically work through referral. So I'm designing things, and then people see them and they ask their friends, like, who designed your menu? I mean, that's how I was able to get restaurant work. Um, and I don't think there exists a marketplace yet in Hawaii for like Hawaii-based graphic designers, but I'm thinking maybe I need to find out if there is one or create something like that.
So
But that maybe the question, is there a marketplace for finding?
I think, yeah, definitely. I mean, I think having entrepreneurs kind of figure out, where to find these resources and how to best connect and align is an important step for these companies to, kind of bridge into finding that right branding partner. So
Right.
thank you. So follow-up question from Lisa. Are there any sensibilities designers should keep in mind working with a client in Hawaii that you experienced?
Are there any sensibilities that designers should keep in mind working with a Hawaii-based brand?
Yeah, that you experienced. Yeah.
Um, hmm. It's kind of hard to talk about that. It's kind of a case by case situation, but we worked a lot with Title Guarantee Hawaii, which is like a title and escrow company, and we were art directing campaigns, and we designed their rebranding, but we also were creating marketing direction. And I remember having these conversations about some cultural like translations in the art direction of photography that needed to be revisited. And I don't know if that was because any particular person um, was imagining it a certain way or not. Like, for example, there was there were some previous campaigns that like had it had like an image of like footprints walking into the water, and we were talking about slippas and how like what does it mean? Like we're trying to interpret the meaning, and we ended up not even using that photo because there was a little bit of confusion on like what the metaphor was in that particular ad campaign. Um, but also, I think um, I don't know. I mean, I think there are some really local brands at like Aloha Stadium and at FoodieCon where I think if you're not from Hawaii, you would probably not even understand the lingo or the jargon. And in my mind, I'm like, oh, this is really just for locals, right? Um, so I think when we're talking about this experiment of like in terms of me talking with you all in this cohort, I'm thinking about like what is it like to export, not necessarily like so. And so I'm trying to think beyond like, and that's what I've been doing with art. Like, what happens when you take art off the island, and it's we can't really control the interpretation of somebody unless we start talking to them and we can have a conversation about it. So yeah, I'm not sure if I'm answering that question either, but doing my best.
Haley, you raised your hand.
Yeah, quick question. Hi, John. Thanks for the presentation. It was very inspiring. For back to CPG, do you suggest founders find a packaging form factor first, get the guidelines, then consult and find a fit with a designer, or can they explore? I mean, I know that probably some things can be done simultaneously, exploring like directions, building a mood board on Pinterest. But I know that in the past, as I worked with our entrepreneurs, it's kind of looking at, I want to do a stand-up pouch or a box, and then looking at some samples of packaging plain, then finding a designer. And sometimes our packaging, I guess, referral suppliers do have their own contract designers. And I think what Chris was alluding to is also like, how do you know that you have a good fit? How do you know that, I have more than one options as well? So I wonder if you have any insights doing any CPG work, whether packaging should come first.
So that's a really good question. And sometimes if people are constrained by price, it'll be the first thing that comes out of their mouth because they know that they can't do one kind of material versus another, and that maybe they can't even afford to do like a custom dye line, and they might have to use some preset. But I tend to think about the branding and the packaging and as like this high level concept that should get interpreted like where all the other things should get interpreted after that. So if, for example, in your branding document, you're talking about a specific audience and it is determined that a certain type of material is not really that big of a difference to that audience, then that kind of high level work in the branding identity section that I did at the presentation, it really sets the tone and a framework for how you can think about approaching a lot of different things in the way that you not just in the way that you package the product, but the way that you market it and the point of display. So I think the high level work, the brand identity work, which is like the mission, vision, the purpose, and the core values, I think those are like number one before you even start talking about packaging, or even like if you don't have a name, even those things are used to help name a product or a brand, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Haley. And so we're at 11. And so just going back to Peter's question. So John, how can we contact you if interested in your services?
So I'll just put my email in the chat.
And we'll also follow up in our post webinar email with more contact information. So it's just Jon at commonspacestudio.com.
Yep.
Awesome. And so John alluded to, we're working on some more programming that will roll out later this year. That will be more hands-on. So stay tuned for that. But again, if nothing else, thank you all for joining us. Jon, thank you so much for being here. Awesome presentation.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for having me.
And then just a quick shout out. So one of our programs, Anan Makeke, we're celebrating the next cohort's graduation tomorrow. Everyone is open to join. It's open to the public. So Naomi dropped in a link to register, but also if you're on our newsletter, you should receive an e-flyer. Also follow us on Instagram, waihuafoodinnovation.com, or not .com, Waihua Food Innovation. But thank you, everyone. Yeah, have a great rest of the week.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everybody.